Morning and welcome everyone to Unity Church-Unitarian. Welcome to this time we set aside each week to help us find and keep our balance, to think about those things that matter most, to root out racism in ourselves and in the world, and to align our lives to integrity, service, and joy. As we reach out from the sanctuary today, we too miss being together in person. Despite the limitations, we hope you will enter in as fully as you can. Light a chalice, speak and sing along, call out the names of those in need. Let worship have its way with you until we are together again. Today, as we move into new ways of being together in the pandemic, our worship leaders on the chancel, Michael Orange, KP Hong, and I, and our guitarist, Jeffrey Van, have all been vaccinated, so you will see us sharing chancel space without masks. We look forward to the day when this can become more common and more widespread. You'll find new guidelines for meetings in the church building starting in June in the June newsletter and in your emails from the church. After the service, whether this is your first time with us or you've been here your whole life, you're invited to participate in a virtual Zoom coffee hour where we share a bit of our lives with each other and get to know one another more deeply. If you would like to learn more about Unity Church and Unitarian Universalism, we invite you to participate in Finding Yourself at Unity today at 1 p.m. This week's 1-hour online class will offer a brief introduction to the historical figures and events that shape Unitarian Universalist theology and practices today. As we passed the anniversary of George Floyd's murder last week, many of us are asking what has changed and what comes next. I hope you'll join us for this week's Wellspring Wednesday evening program for a Peace Circle process that invites us to consider and listen to one another as we share in an evening titled, What's Changed? Everything and Nothing. I want to especially thank Michael Orange for his partnership in creating today's worship service and to congratulate him on his second book, just published this month, Embracing the Ghosts, PTSD and the Vietnam Quagmire. It serves as a bookend to the wartime stories he shared in his first book and is available online. We expect to hold a book event with Michael in the fall. So watch for that. Coming up next weekend, Unity's Act for the Earth team is organizing Unity Church members and friends to stand together with our indigenous neighbors to stop the construction of the Line 3 pipeline. This call to action, to be held June 5th through the 8th in northern Minnesota, is an effort to protect treaty rights, water, and limit climate change by stopping fossil fuel extraction. To learn more about this Treaty People gathering and the other offerings shared this morning, please visit Unity's homepage. Next Sunday, during a service entitled Upended and Awakened, Reverend KP Hong and Worship Associate Nate Solas introduce the June worship theme of awakening and explore awakening as a people of faith. Once again, welcome to Unity Church. It is a gift to share this hour together.
Charlie Porter. I was a Union soldier in '61. I signed up to fight, and it was a great adventure. But I have to tell you, not the fairy tale I had in mind. And when General Lee surrendered, victory finally arrived, I heard no one hoot or holler, no hip hooray for the stars and stripes. Back when it started, proud and foolish hearted, I thought I had a taste for rebel blood. But we were only children. They killed us and we killed them, and the misery and the dying made us numb. By then, holding back the sorrow was kinda like holding back the tide. I heard no one hoot or holler, no hip hooray for the stars and stripes. We only cried. Victory seems hollow at the price of 500,000 lives. A cold, weary stillness follows. You hear no hip hooray for stars and stripes. You only cry. Charlie Porter was a Union soldier.
The Confederate attack on Fort Sumter 160 years ago last month marked the start of the Civil War. Civil War, that sterile war classification, is the antithesis of uncivilized atrocity that is war. Peter Mayer's poignant song, Charlie Porter, captures the soul of not just one Civil War soldier, but the souls of soldiers in every war. His words, "My name is Charlie Porter. I was a Union soldier. In '61, I signed up to fight. It was a great adventure, but I have to tell you, not the fairy tale I had in mind. Back when it started, proud and foolish-hearted, I thought I had a taste for rebel blood, but we were only children. They killed us, and we killed them, and the misery and the dying made us numb. On this somber Memorial Day observation, may we find the tears to shed for those lost to war, as well as for those who witnessed and suffered from the tragedies of wars, conflicts, and systemic racism. And may we become calm and centered in a space appropriate for remembrance, a space where there's room for awareness, transformation, understanding, and peace. Come, let us worship and lift our voices in the singing of the hymn, I Wish I Knew How.
I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all these chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things I could say. Say 'em loud, say 'em clear for the whole world to hear. Say 'em loud, say 'em clear for the whole world to hear. I wish I could share all the love in my heart. Remove all the bars that still keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree everyone should be free. Then you'd see and agree everyone should be free. I wish I could give all I'm longing to give. I wish I could live like I'm longing to live. I wish I could do all the things I can do. Though I'm way overdue, I'd be starting anew. Though I'm way overdue, I'd be starting anew. I wish I could be like a bird in the sky. How sweet it would be if I found I could fly. I'd soar to the sun and look down at the sea. Then I'd sing 'cause I know how it feels to be free. Then I'd sing 'cause I know how it feels to be free.
Please join with me in the reading of this quote from Washington Irving. There is sacredness in tears. They are not the mark of weakness, but of power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are the messengers of overwhelming grief, of deep contrition, and of unspeakable love. Please join me in a moment of silence.
Each time we gather for worship, we set aside a moment to expand the caring ministry of this congregation. Together, we recognize the cycle of life and death, the circle of love, compassion, and witness that is at the center of this and every sacred community. We stand at the side of parents and teachers and all those whose primary spiritual practice is caring for children. With those who live with grief or chronic pain, with illnesses seen and unseen, with mental disability or addiction. We pray for our neighbors in prison, for those who care for family members in ill health, and those who are struggling to stay afloat in the midst of poverty. Our lives are blessed by those who knowingly and with curiosity and courage face their final days, and by those who rise above heartbreak to challenge oppression in all its forms. We pray for those in harm's way, for the wisdom and strength of the leaders of the world, and for the people of this courageous congregation, as together we live into our longing to embody and help to build the beloved community. Will you pray with me for all these we now name? We celebrate the life and mourn the death of Harold Sheff, husband of Unity member Virgie Sheff. Harold died in the hospital early Wednesday morning, surrounded by his loving family. A memorial service will be planned in the future. We also celebrate the life and mourn the death of Jim Meisenheimer, who died this past week after a rapidly progressing cancer. Jim was lovingly accompanied in his final weeks by his wife, Carol Gage, his daughter, and many, many friends. A celebration of his life will be planned by the family in the future. And we continue to hold Deborah Olson in our loving embrace as her friends and family gather with her and support her in care and love in her final days. Lastly, we acknowledge all the currents of grief that flow around the world as lives are compromised or lost to both COVID-19 and systemic racism. Today, we especially name our sorrow for our children struck down by gun violence here in the Twin Cities in recent weeks. We hold in our caring embrace the family and friends of 9-year-old Trinity Addison Smith, who died in the hospital on Thursday after being shot 2 weeks earlier while jumping on a trampoline in Minneapolis. Her death follows that of 6-year-old Anya Allen, shot while riding in her mother's car, who died on May 19th. And we continue to pray for the recovery of 10-year-old Ladavion Garrett Jr., who remains hospitalized after being shot 1 month ago, also while riding in a vehicle in Minneapolis. And we pray for all those whose lives and well-being were shattered by last night's shooting in South Florida. May we be emboldened by our grief to honor these losses and so many others by standing up to violence in all its forms. May we stand in compassionate solidarity with our neighbors here at home and all around the world. May they and may we be instruments of a just and lasting peace. I now invite you to speak aloud or hold in the silent sanctuary of your hearts the names of those you would like to lift up today in worship. And let us pray. Holy One, source of all being and promise of all our becoming, in this season of so much grief, let us not turn away from the transformative power grief brings, opening our hearts to our own losses and to those of others. Let us share the sorrows of this time with compassion and a healing hope that they might change our ways, that we might find new understanding and awareness and greater courage to powerfully and peaceably stand up to violence, to find new ways of making room for conflict without resorting to physical threat or force to resolve it. To let grief guide us back to our shared humanity and to the possibilities of peace that can only come when no one's humanity is denied. May it be so, and amen.
How do we, the living, honor the dead? And on Memorial Day, which has its origins in the Civil War and the tradition of decorating the graves of fallen soldiers, soldiers who died not because of accident or old age, but who died in the destruction and violence of war. How do we, the living, honor the war dead? After the parade has gone, after the speeches have ended, after everyone falls silent and the lone bugle plays taps, how do we remember? How do we mourn? How do we, who are the living, honor the dead? With the children who are joining this worship service, as we do, come a little closer as you are able to the screen for this story for all ages. Thousands of unknown Civil War soldiers are buried in cemeteries all across our nation. Many died in battle. Many died in prison camps. In Andersonville, Georgia, on 27 acres of land, there is a national cemetery that dates back to the Civil War. Under a large canopy of beautiful trees, there are rows and rows and rows of marble headstones marking the soldiers who had died, the soldiers who were Union Army soldiers from the North who had been captured by the Confederate South and put in prison camps there in Andersonville, Georgia. And there is one peculiar gravesite. If you can find your way to Section K of Anderson National Cemetery and find grave number 2428, which belongs to one Sergeant Samuel Vernon of the North Union Army. He was captured by the Confederate South soldiers and imprisoned at that prison camp and died in June of 1864. There would be nothing special or remarkable about that gravesite or Sergeant Samuel Vernon, except for the fact that he had a daughter named Jenny Vernon back home north on the Union side in Lafayette, Indiana. For after the Civil War and the immediate years following, as a nation grieved and needed to mourn, communities found themselves going out to the cemeteries and cleaning and decorating with flowers the gravestones of the war dead. And you need to know that Lafayette, Indiana, was one of the sites for another prison camp. And the Confederate soldiers who died, they were buried in a local cemetery in Lafayette, Indiana. In 1868, for the first Remembrance Day, for celebration of that first Decoration Day, the committee of Lafayette, as they were getting ready to go to the cemeteries and to put flower wreaths, they received in the mail a flower wreath and a special note attached to it from a 10-year-old girl whose name was Jenny Vernon. And the note read this: "Will you please put this wreath on a Confederate soldier's grave? My papa is buried in Andersonville, and perhaps a little girl there will be kind enough to put a few flowers upon his grave." The committee placed Jenny's wreath on a Confederate's gravesite. And the newspaper printed this story, which caught on, and that summer, the story spread throughout the nation. And as the nation began to grieve and mourn, they started to place flowers on both Union and Confederate gravesites. For whether North or South, what was common at these gatherings were the weeping and the mourning of mothers for their children, and the weeping of children for their parents. At these gravesites, what was common was a nation finally beginning to understand the real cost of war. And perhaps a nation beginning to learn how we truly honor the fallen dead, those who had fought in wars as old as human history, that perhaps we honor them best by learning how to wage peace and to build a more just and peaceful world. It is not known back in 1868 whether Jenny Vernon's gesture was returned in kind, perhaps by some other little girl who went to Sergeant Vernon's graveside and placed a wreath of flowers. But we do know that today there are children who go with Jenny's stories to Andersonville National Cemetery, and they know where to find Section K and grave number 2428, where they will leave their flowers. They know Jenny Vernon's story. And perhaps they and all of us are learning what it means to truly honor the dead. May it be so. And amen.
Your support of Unity Church is an expression of the promises we make to one another and to the world. Though the future is unclear, we can't let fear undermine the strength of our ministry and the ministries we share. Please do your best to be generous with the church so that the church in turn can maintain its programs and its staff and our promises to our community partners. And Michael will tell you about the partner with whom we will share today's offering.
Today, as with so many Sundays in the past, Unity Church will be sharing the offerings with the local chapter of Veterans for Peace. That's chapter 27. I and several other members of the church are members, long-term members. The group nationally and locally works very hard for all kinds of peace efforts, but primarily to abolish war and the stockpiling of nuclear weapons.
We hope you will be generous with your support of Veterans for Peace. During the interlude, during the music that follows, please visit Unity's homepage or follow the link on YouTube information to make your contribution. Or you can also nominate another organization for a future offering. You can also mail in a check or click on the Give function in Unity's membership app. Thank you. War Story by Brett Lott. This was the story he gave his wife once he'd married after the war, and the story he gave his children, the story he gave his children's children. It was no hero's story, he knew, but only a story of what he'd done, how he'd served with the blessing of his hands at a time when he'd been needed. Only a story of how he helped. And they listened every time he told them the story as though this were the first time they'd heard it. It was in the way he told it, the way he held his head, the angle of his jaw, the cut of his eyes as he chose his words, words not meant to impress them with the feats of a man before them, but words meant to share the shard of the war he'd witnessed. They listened and knew him because of the story. They all owned a piece of him, carried the story in them like shards of their own lives. His story, their own story, they believed, for the way he told it made them feel as though they had been there. They listened.
We light this candle for the millions of soldiers lost to war then and now and still tomorrow. First observed 5 years after the end of the Civil War, Memorial Day was originally intended to commemorate soldiers who died during that war. Ironically, recent research has revealed that the first commemoration of the war to free the slaves actually occurred less than a month after the end of the war by a group of newly freed slaves. They honored the Union soldiers who had died in a squalid Confederate prison camp nearby in Charleston, South Carolina, just as KP was talking about earlier. Wars have a long reach through time. In many ways, the ravages of the Civil War still echo today through institutionalized white supremacy and the politics of hate and division. Racism still wounds and kills, as the murder of George Floyd a year ago and a few miles away from here occurred just 1 year ago, tragically demonstrates. Anyone who has served in war knows that even if you survive it, war can also kill a part of you and extend its poisonous reach through you to those you love. As Peter Mayer sings in his song, "But we were only children. They killed us and we killed them, and the misery and the dying made us numb. By then, holding back the sorrow was kind of like holding back the tide." We'll light another candle for the millions of family members and loved ones who shoulder the profound grief of the losses to war. And now, a third candle for those wounded and killed by the wars of racism and for the numbness that spreads from so much dying. I went to war when I was a little over 20, not a child, but not yet an adult. When I arrived at the Cleveland airport after my tour of duty in Vietnam, I just sat down, paralyzed with befuddled emotions. I didn't even call my parents to let them know I had arrived in my hometown. I was afraid. I was afraid my family would expect to see the person I was and not the person I had become. That they would not forgive me for what I had done and not done in Vietnam. And how could they when I couldn't forgive myself? Like some toxic virus morphing in a petri dish, the war infected my moral DNA. I came home no longer thinking with the same mind or seeing with the same eyes or hearing with the same ears. The Marines had trained me in the belief that I could kill people because they would be trying to kill me. They were the enemy. And the rounds I fired in Vietnam did kill people. And some of them were trying to kill me. But of course, most of them, we now know, were probably civilians, just caught in the carnage that is war. Where is their Memorial Day? We light a candle for the millions of civilians lost to war then and now and still tomorrow. Sitting in that airport terminal, I was neither able to judge my actions and my inactions, nor fully grasp the transformation I had undergone. I found it hard to describe the differences between life in a war zone and life back in the world, as we soldiers referred to it. In combat, emotions become so extreme they create their polar opposites. Terror can spark the adrenalized excitement. Panic can birth the resolution required to control it. And I remember the unrelenting chaos of a firefight, and I remember hugging, scrambling, trying to burrow into the ground with the thought that maybe burrowing into it could save me or prevent me from being buried in it. I remember screaming into the cacophony, I want it to stop, I want it to stop. In Vietnam, we had a mantra. It don't mean nothing. It don't mean nothing. It was a necessary, all-purpose lie that we used as a bandage to keep our consciences from bleeding out. We used it as a mask to hide our faces from ourselves, from each other, and from our role as aggressors. We got good at telling this lie, and we kept telling it even after we came home to a nation that didn't want to hear our stories. Vietnam gave me the opportunity to explore the very best in me and the very worst in me. Marine Corps boot camp was designed to swap out the civilian ethics that we were raised with militaristic replacements needed to deal with the barbarism that is war. But when we were discharged, there was no boot camp to reverse engineer the process. We light a candle for what has been lost and poisoned in the soldiers who have experienced the horrors of war. When I came home, I was suffering from what would come to be known as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Even though it formed the fault line of my personality change, I repressed the war, my experiences, and especially what I had learned about my dark side. It don't mean nothing. It just don't mean nothing. I went back to college that fall in 1970, and I tried to fit back into the cocoon of college. I had to restrain my urge to revolt at the triviality of my classmates' concerns. I still had friends rotting back in the jungles of Vietnam. It strained my nerves until I thought they would fry from too much voltage. But instead of screaming, I just went along with the conversation, like pretending I understood the language. In Vietnam, I heard stories of war protesters, and I knew my college friends thought the war was immoral. I gave this some weight, but there I had more important matters to attend to, looking for that tripwire one pace ahead, or straining bomb crater water through my teeth. I needed a moral handhold there, illusory though it was, that we were doing something important, something necessary, something honorable. But I did this as I hung over the cliff of the war's dark insanity. And after returning home and going to college on my Kent State University campus, I lost my voice. I had no railroad tracks to put my ear to see what was steaming my way. Fearful of the stigma society laid on us Vietnam veterans, I became a closet vet. I knew my handholds were slipping. As Peter Mayer's song continues, a cold and weary stillness follows. You hear no hip hooray for stars and stripes. You only cry. We light a candle for the stillness and the grief. 33 years later, after coming home, I started PTSD therapy. With the life-saving, non-judgmental love and wisdom from my wife, Cynthia. We've been married almost 48 years now. How are we doing that? I began to peck my way into a new world full of potential. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh spoke to this kind of life-saving transformation at a 5-day retreat I attended in 2003. He said, "Veterans are the light at the tip of the candle, illuminating the way for the whole nation. If veterans can achieve awareness, transformation, understanding, and peace, they can share with the rest of society the realities of war. And they can teach us how to make peace with ourselves and each other so we never have to use violence to resolve conflicts again." I'd like to close with a quote from the former emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie. And it's a really appropriate quote on this day born of the Civil War because it clarifies the symbiotic relationship between racism and war. This is what he wrote. "Until the philosophy that holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, and until the color of a man's skin is of no more significance than the color of his eyes, everywhere is war." Everywhere is war. And Thich Nhat Hanh describes us war veterans as the light at the tip of the candle, but only if we can achieve awareness, transformation, understanding, and peace. But all of us must become the light at the tip of our own candle to transform our lives and help heal our racist, conflict-ridden world. We light a candle for those who return from war with tears and stories that might change all in ways that could make peace possible.
As we have done so many times in years gone by, we take time on this Memorial Day weekend to honor and remember those whose lives have been lost to war and to honor those who have survived and known the suffering that war brings. We now light these candles to honor and remember those loved ones you have named for their service. We light the first candle for James Funk, memorialized by Mike Funk, who tells us Jim served in the United States Air Force from 1948 to 1974. His assignments included duty in England and Korea, as well as bases in 7 states. He loved the service life and relished opportunities it brought. Mark Stange remembers Commander Hugo Stange, U.S. Naval Reserve, World War II, Navy Harbor Master in Papua New Guinea, South Pacific after college. After the war, Hugo stayed active in the reserves and retired as a commander. We light another candle for Bob Tonelli, who served in Korea, Vietnam, and Japan, and later as a career Army officer. He was one of the unusual commissioned officers to be promoted from the field instead of on the basis of a college degree. Darcy Vandegrift reports that Bob died this past March and says we miss him very much. We light another candle, remembering with Sue Doffing her cousin, Private Second Class Jeffrey Wanka, who was shot down in the Vietnam War. We light a candle with Sharon Merritt, remembering Tom Merritt, who served during the Vietnam War as a Supply Corps officer for the U.S. Navy from 1966 to 1971, first as commissary officer in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and later as supply officer on the USS James K. Polk, a Polaris submarine, where he also learned to be a diving officer. Our beloved Unity member Tom died last summer, and we miss him very much. We light 2 candles for those memorialized by Richard Berger, remembering Artie Pfeffer, Arthur Thomas Pfeffer, Captain U.S. Army in Vietnam, killed in action July 25, 1969, and Spencer Coyle, who was a wildland firefighter killed in the Devil's Den wildfire near Beaver, Utah. He was acting as a forward observer when he became trapped and overran by the fire. Spencer left a wife and 3 small children, ages 7, 4, and 18 months. We light a candle with Don Morrill, remembering Lieutenant Colonel Robert C. Morrill, who landed as second lieutenant on D-Day +1, June 7, 1944, and was wounded twice in the European theater. He also served in the Korean War as a major in 1951 to 52. We light 3 memorial candles for those named by Mary Kanadarud, her father, Alden Kanadarud, who trained pilots in World War II, her uncle, Jerry Kanadarud, who served in Germany in the post-war years, and her aunt, Helen Kanadarud, who served as a nurse in England in World War II. They all survived the war, but never forgot their experiences. We light this candle with Zora Kinney, honoring her older brother Ted, always so kind to his 3 sisters and his wife. Although he did not want to go, he served in Vietnam in the Army in 1971. He came back after a mental health crisis and now bravely lives every day with schizophrenia. We join Ken Green in lighting 2 candles, memorializing his father, Major Kenneth L. Green, who was killed in action in Herlisheim, France, just north of Strasbourg on January 17th, 1945, and the second candle memorializing his stepdad, Russell C. Goddard, who landed on Utah Beach on the second hour of D-Day and afterward fought in the hedgerows of France with the 4th Infantry Division. He helped liberate Paris and then in the late fall fought the Battle of Hurricane Forest just before the Battle of the Bulge. He returned home but carried the horror of war all the rest of his life. With Michael Orange, we light 7 candles for his fellow Kent State classmates, Jeffrey, Sandra, William, and Allison, who were killed by the Ohio National Guard at an anti-war protest on May 4th, 1970, and 3 more candles for his fellow Marines, John, Martin, and Paul, who also lost their lives to the Vietnam War, 2 of them after they returned home due to suicide. We light 2 candles on request from Richard Wolfgram. The first for Green Beret Sergeant Major Gail Stouffer, Detachment A-101, Maylock, Special Forces Group, Airborne, killed in action 2nd of March, 1970, when the camp was overrun by the North Vietnamese Army. And the second candle was for Green Beret Captain Richard A. Hostika, Camp Commander, Detachment A-101, Maylock, Special Forces Group, Airborne, died April 10th, 1970, while in combat zone during a military operation. We light a candle for Karen Herring's cousin, Jim Herring, who served as first lieutenant in the U.S. Army from 1965 to 68. He survived active duty in Vietnam and returned home determined to enlist himself in new directions. Since then, he has foster parented 40 children and continues to serve as a hospice volunteer and chaplain, accompanying countless veterans as they cross death's threshold. We light a candle for Laurel Lee Widerstrom's cousin, Marine Captain Kelly Hines and his father, Navy pilot Don Hines. Kelly was killed in May of 2005 at age 30 when his jet collided with another while on a mission over south central Iraq. Less than a year earlier, his father Don died when a World War II-era plane was flying, made an emergency landing during an air show in Wisconsin. Laura Lee notes, "They will never be forgotten." Excuse me, one more sheet. We light a candle with Cynthia Orange memorializing her uncle Bud Marsh with these words. Shell shock was how my dad explained his brother's often erratic behavior. Uncle Bud, she says, was one of the few survivors of his South Pacific Army unit in World War II. He spent months in hospitals recovering from malaria and other wounds, but the poison of war was always with him. Mary Diaz asks that we light a candle for her father, Charles Conrad. She writes, although my father died of natural causes much later in life, his time in the Army as a 17-year-old during World War II in Germany took its toll on him as he watched his fellow soldiers die while he survived. And we light 2 more candles honoring Kathy Rucci's sister, Kim Clauser, and Kim's husband, Scott Clauser. Kim enlisted in the Army after high school, and Scott served in the Air Defense Artillery Branch, both deployed during the Gulf War and are combat vets. Kim served for 11 years and discharged following the birth of their second child. Scott retired from the Army after 24 years of service. And these last 3 candles we light for all those named, known, and unknown whose lives have been cut short by war. By the light of these candles, may we learn another way. Thank you. I have never been one to comprehend large numbers. Every time I visited Arlington National Cemetery and stood before those white stone markers extending as far as I can see, I lose myself in the infinity of the loss. For while numbers tell a story of their own about the size of things, they can also obscure what's being tallied. In this case, the human faces they represent, each one telling a story of the depth of things. So it is fitting in this Memorial Day service that we began by hearing from one soldier who returned home to tell the story of battles fought far away and those fought still today in the minefields of the traumatized human heart. Thank you, Michael, for your reflection and for shaping this service with me today. Thank you for helping us all, soldiers and civilians alike, to find our way into a remembrance of war that speaks of its true depth in a way that might begin our shared transformational journey toward healing and understanding, which is to say, toward peace. This is not, I want to be clear, an easy way. As Peter Mayer's song says, it is not marked by hoot or holler nor hip hooray, but rather by our tears. So on this Memorial Weekend, we remember not with fanfare, but with grief. In recognizing Memorial Weekend, we remember those whose lives were cut short by wars past and present. We remember those whose bodies, minds, and spirits have been harmed by warfare far away and here in our own streets. We remember the trail of sorrow that lingers long after the ticker tape victory parades have gone by. And as we do, unfortunately, it requires no memory at all to know the terror and suffering spreading every day right now through the Middle East and in Afghanistan and in so many places in the grip of war today. Nor do we need historians to make us aware of how many lives are still falling under continued racial violence, casting a war-like shadow across the United States today. We are collectively and individually carrying the grief of many losses, of those conflicts named as war and those cloaked under other guises, of racism, of immigrants denied their flight for life, of mass shootings, and this is deepened by the grief brought on by the pandemic. We cannot avoid or deny the tide of grief rising in our hearts. The question is, what will we do with it? Will we try to hold it at bay, masking our faces from ourselves and one another? Or will we let our tears come, share our grief with one another, come back into our bodies, which is how and where we remember that we are all interrelated, that human suffering cannot be privatized, and that likewise our healing too is not solitary, but something we take on together, learning to see and know and acknowledge our shared humanity. Perhaps you saw it too. That moment in the Derek Chauvin trial when the witness, Charles McMillan, watched again the video of George Floyd's arrest and of Charles McMillan himself pleading with George Floyd to cooperate to avoid being hurt by the police. Then, reliving the terror and the trauma of that moment on the front lines of America's uncivil war of racism, Mr. McMillan broke down in tears. Not a silent trickle running down his cheek, but the sobbing of a tide held back too long, of a lifetime as a Black man in America navigating the dehumanization of racism and the violence that keeps it in place. Millions around the world watched him cry, as millions had seen George Floyd's death almost 1 year earlier. Friends, if this past year can be named as a season, we might aptly name it as a season of collective grief. Let us ask ourselves on this Memorial Weekend, what will we do with our grief? Are we brave and bold enough to let it in and let it out, to feel it, to share it, to let it lead us to our healing? If this is frightening for you to consider, I invite you into a simple gesture of crossing your hands like this, hooking thumbs and holding them to your heart. And as you give your heart this embrace, if you tap your fingers alternately on either side and do that long enough to settle the nerves, the fear, the anxiety that can come from grief. Do that now or any time you need to stay in your body, to let yourself feel and be led by your grief. Because as anyone who has experienced deep grief knows, it has the power to shift us off center, to dislodge us from our sense of self in a frighteningly disorienting way, to shroud our eyes and obstruct our ears, to rattle our nerves, to send us running from our own bodies, to steal our orientation and balance. No wonder we try to hold it back. No wonder we shield our hearts from its terrible touch. But that disorientation, that loss of balance is exactly what we need to heal, to discover who we really are and how we belong to one another in our grief and also in our joyous journey to a lasting peace within and, yes, among us. The poet Mary Oliver wrote, "I tell you this to break your heart. by which I mean only that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world. Last month, on a cold, gray April day, that day when the jury in the Derek Chauvin trial began its deliberations, I made my way to the George Floyd Memorial Square to pay tribute to that sacred ground where George Floyd was murdered. Afterwards, I stopped a few blocks away at that small urban field where just 2 weeks after George Floyd's death, 2 artists created the Say Their Names Cemetery. There, 7 rows of white plastic grave markers memorialize over 100 Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been killed by police. On the small grassy incline of that at the far end of the field, large white letters staked in the grass declare, "Say their names." So I did on that April day. I walked slowly up and down each row, saying each of the 100 names out loud. Tears washed my eyes, the wind cleared my ears. A few unseasonably late snowflakes blew around me as if the sky were crying frozen tears as well. And as I returned to the beginning where George Floyd's marker stands front and center, I discovered I was no longer alone. A white man in full army uniform stood tall and straight and greeted me. I flinched at his military presence in that moment, and then I heard his story. He was from Mississippi, a veteran of the Iraq War and the great-grandson of Confederate Colonel James Z. George, who was later elected to the U.S. Senate, where, as a senator, he helped to author and pass the Jim Crow laws, intentionally disenfranchising Black voters. Senator James George's great-grandson told me that seeing the murder of George Floyd last year had planted a seed in his own heart, moving him into action. He had come to the Twin Cities that week to meet with George Floyd's family and to learn how he might participate in the healing of our shared losses, to participate in the transformation of our deep grief, to help turn our nation in a new and just direction. We stood there together, 2 white people, one from the north, one from the south, one soldier, one civilian, in the cold and weary stillness, surrounded by the silent markers engraved with too many names, each one representing a life cut short by the war that rages on each day. I tell you this to break your heart, by which I mean only that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world. What will you do with your grief? How will you make time and room in your life to let grief dislodge you from where you have been before, to let your heart open you to your own humanity and that of all others? We close today by lighting 2 more candles, one for awareness and transformation, and another for understanding and for peace. May the flickering light at the tip of these candles be what guides us. May the grief that opens our hearts today and on any day to come be a door we keep open, a door to healing, a door to transformation, a door to peace. May it be so. Ashe and Amen. The hymn is "Lift Every Voice and sing. Please join us.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing arise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past till we now stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, Thou who hast by Thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met Thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget Thee. Shadowed beneath Thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
I tell you this to break your heart, by which I mean just that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world. Friends, with our hearts broken open, may these be the candles, the light of these candles that guides us toward understanding, transformation, toward awareness, and towards peace. Let us follow that light.